Hello and welcome to our Tuesday show. Coming up, the impressions of a Kuwaiti who has just returned home for the first time since the Iraqi invasion. And then a debate on whether children are reliable witnesses in abuse cases. The first half of our program is devoted to our World Challenges Roundtable. Each day at this time, we discuss and debate the issues in the news with some of the prominent thinkers of our day. And today we'll start discussing free speech rights with Edwin Meese, U.S. Attorney General from 1985 to 1988, currently holding the Ronald Reagan Chair in Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative Washington-based think tank. And Edwin Lawson, the executive director of Pro-Per Incorporated, a Beverly Hills think tank that promotes First Amendment rights. And Barbara Ehrenreich, a feminist writer whose latest works include The Worst Years of Our Lives, Irreverent Notes on a Decade of Greed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you. And Mr. Meese, we'll start with you. Is the First Amendment alive and well in the United States today? Any concerns that citizens should have about that?
Well, I think it's alive and well for the most part, but I think the greatest threat to the First Amendment today is this so-called politically correct dogma that is being preached on some of our campuses, where certain ideas are prohibited by regulation, certain speech is being limited, and I think that's the greatest threat to the First Amendment that I can see.
Mr. Lawson, your feelings about this?
Well, this is probably one of those worst-case scenarios that you've always been terrified of happening, but I have to state that I agree with Mr. Meese. I think that those who are liberals cannot exercise the same tyranny that we've seen from the reactionary, the conservative, all the way back to the British in trying to determine who should have the right to hear what. So this is history. I agree with Mr. Meese.
Well, you also gave us a delicious lesson, Mr. Lawson, in the fact that as we have roundtables such as these, it's very interesting whom one starts to agree with. And Ms. Ehrenreich, let me ask you the same question. Any concerns about First Amendment rights?
Oh, yes, but that's the last one I would have mentioned. I think that the politically correct phenomenon is very tiny. I mean, there's a few campuses, mostly the elite campuses, where that has, that's been part of the atmosphere. I would say the biggest threat has been censorship, the biggest threat to freedom of speech.
Tell us a little more about that.
Well, during the Gulf War, we had censorship of the press. We had very censored view of what we could see. I think that there was a very hostile atmosphere toward dissent in this country, and I think that is alarming. I think Mr. Meese is blowing out of all proportion what is going on in the campuses. So, of course, I agree. Speech should not be censored, even if it's uncomfortable forms of speech. Let
me ask you, if I may, Ms. Ehrenreich, we'll get back to this, but what do you see as the greatest challenges to America today?
Well, I think the greatest single challenge would be to take some of the enthusiasm and the patriotism that has come out of this war and now apply it to our domestic problems. Apply it to problems like AIDS, like homelessness, like the fact that 37 million Americans have no health insurance. And, of course, to meet the real needs of the returning troops who come from the poorest one-third of the population in terms of income, who are coming back, in many cases, to debts. Perhaps they won't have their jobs when they get back. So I would say that's an immediate thing. How are we really going to support our troops now?
Mr. Lawson, what do you see as the greatest challenge to America now?
Well, that's interesting. If I were to go into the broadest field of consideration, I think the greatest challenge to America over the course of the next decade will be the restoration of the American middle class. I think the last decade of Reaganomics, as we've described them, have destroyed the middle class by destroying the American job, by exporting that job to Manila, to Seoul, to Mexico City. The destruction of the single-family wage earner has destroyed the family, has destroyed the lives of countless Americans, either reduced them to the homeless or reduced them to the working poor.
Now, we're going to come back to you in a bit, Mr. Lawson, if you may, because I know that if you have a critique, you're also a measure of a man who has some suggestions. We want to be sure to find out how you're going to resolve that. But let's go to Mr. Meese and ask about the greatest challenge from his point of view.
Well, first, I think it's important to say that I certainly disagree with Mr. Lawson because actually what happened was all parts of the economy, all segments of the economy, all people during the Reagan years improved their position economically. Indeed, that was the period where we had the largest amount of job creation in the history of the country, and most of those were middle-class jobs. But let me say that I think that there are three major things that ought to occupy our attention, three major challenges to the United States and to the world to some extent, but particularly here at home. I think it is the problem of crime and drugs, which are still among us, still have a tremendous impact, particularly on low-income people in cities. It's the matter of education. We have to improve our education. We've vastly increased the amount of money we put into education over the last 10 years, way above the rate of inflation, and yet the quality of education has not increased proportionally. And thirdly, I think we have to deal with the economy. Federal spending is still out of control, and that's what's feeding the big deficits.
Now, Mr. Meese, how do you think President Bush is going to do with that? We all probably could agree that he showed brilliant leadership in the recent past with the war. How is he going to do winning the war of the peace after the war here in America?
Well, I hope the way he would do it would be to adopt some of the things that we at the Heritage Foundation are suggesting. One of them is to cut taxes. We certainly ought to cut the payroll tax, the Social Security payroll tax, which is now a heavy burden on many working Americans. We ought to cut the capital gains tax so that we will continue to increase jobs and improve our ability to be competitive in the world. We ought to improve the ability of Americans to save through IRA accounts, those sorts of things, and also to allow businesses to expense or to deduct immediately the cost of investment in capital investment so that they can continue to expand and provide new jobs.
Let me stop you there and see if Mr. Lawson agrees. Mr. Lawson?
Well, your program is now back on course. I completely disagree with all 3 points. Number one of the things that the last 10 years of Washington has given to the American people is what we call creative economics, voodoo economics when Mr. Bush was on the outside. One aspect of that is they create their own numbers. Don't take my word for what the American economy looks like. Don't take Mr. Meese's or the Heritage Foundation's word for what the American economy looks like. Walk outside the door in your main street anywhere in the country. There are homeless people who are there who were not there 10 years ago. And I think that that kind of counting the people that favor their statistical objective is what they have in mind. For example, they say that the net creation of jobs has been positive. What they're talking about is destroying steel workers' jobs and sending them to Seoul and replacing them with what they euphemistically refer to as service jobs, which means that people who used to work in steel mills are now hairdressers. Are we to become a nation of hairdressers and by so doing maintain the economic supremacy that we've known heretofore? I suggest
Mr. Lawson, let me just interrupt. That's absolutely wrong. Manufacturing is now a higher percentage of the jobs in the United States and of our total economy than it was in 1980. You just don't have the facts. And if you're going to go out and look at homeless people and make judgments on our economy from anecdotal evidence as opposed to looking at what's really taking place and looking at the statistics, then you're never going to solve the problems.
We have to let Ms. Ehrenreich get in here. Gentlemen, equal time here.
When I look at it, it's
Mr. Lawson, we're just going to have you reverberate that in your mind for a moment and allow Barbara to get in here. Barbara?
Well, let's talk about numbers then. 50% of the new jobs created in the private sector in the 1980s were at near poverty wages. That's one of the reasons why working class people, sort of middle class people, have seen their wages actually decline by 10% in the 1980s. And the decline was particularly rapid, almost twice as fast, for young males who are our soldiers, the category that includes our soldiers. So no, you don't have to look at anecdotes. Statistically, things have gotten worse for people at the middle. And then it amazes me to hear Mr. Meese talk about the same old thing. He wants to cut taxes for the middle class, which isn't a bad idea. I'd love to see that. But he wants to cut taxes for the rich again. Another capital gains tax cut. And then we're supposed to wait for the benefits to trickle down. Well, we waited all through the 80s, and it didn't happen, and that will get us nowhere.
Mr. Meese, may I ask you to reserve your comments, please? We're going to go to our audience. We have really laid out a variety of points of view. A great time for our audience to join us. I'm going to give the number. It's 212-643-0077. Come and join us.